Good evening. I'm Mary Clark, Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor at the University of Denver, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's third annual faculty and community event entitled Seeing Plants and Sustaining Communities. It is our privilege to discuss these topics of sustainability and environmental justice with a panel of DU faculty moderated by Leander Lacy, who I'll introduce in a moment. Our panelists' presentations will focus on sustainability and justice affecting land, plants, and food at various scales from local to national levels, while applying the impacts of humans and management on these areas. But first, it is my honor to welcome and introduce Leander Lacy. A trained environmental social scientist, Lacy is the CEO of Lacy Consulting Services LLC, an organization that works with environmental organizations and sustainability-focused businesses to reach their communities and goals through applied social science and robust relationship building. Therefore, he is the perfect facilitator of tonight's conversation. He is the interim director of Metropolitan Denver Nature Alliance, of which DU is a member. Lacy also runs the Green Mind podcast, which focuses on interviewing people from around the world who work at the intersection of people and nature. Please welcome Leander Lacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction. I'm very excited to be able to host this for you today. This is a very exciting discussion, and I think the idea of focusing around plants is so important and critical as we think about sustaining communities. And you think about the plant from the root systems to the stems to the leaves, every part of it is important. And just in the same way that communities, there are so many different parts of communities that are important to think about and acknowledge in this process. And one of the things I want to talk about here as well, before I introduce our panel speakers, is why this is so important. Why even talk about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or sustaining communities? You might say, Leander, this is just about plants. Like, what possibly could this be about, equity issues or inclusivity issues? And it turns out very much it has to do with those topics. Sometimes we don't see that because we're so hyper-focused on just protecting our favorite plant or our favorite wildlife species or our favorite, habitat type, when sometimes we forget about the connection to people and society and to communities and how impactful that is. And I wanted to share a story as to why I see it all connecting together. And this goes way back when I was an undergraduate and why I even chose to get into the conservation field overall. And I remember being in my wildlife ecology and conservation course at University of Florida. And I was actually going for veterinary medicine. So I had not even made the decision to be in conservation whatsoever. And I remember one critical question that changed the course of my career. I remember asking the question, once we do all of these wonderful studies, we understand the landscape, we understand the plants and animals and everything within, and we have these great studies, who goes and actually talks to, what I said at the time was, who goes to talk to the people in the hood? Because I grew up in the hood and I don't remember anyone talking to me about bears and specific tree species or plant species or water species. That wasn't really part of the conversation I had, either around the dinner table or in our schools. So outside of the fact that they had no idea what the hood was when I talked to them about this topic, that once we got past that, they said to me, and it was very clear to me, they said, Leander, people get into conservation to not talk to people. We just want to protect what we want to protect. We want to make sure that it stays in perpetuity, and that's really important to us. And I said to myself at that time, you know what, that's a problem. There's a need, there's a gap here that needs to be filled. And I want to dedicate my career to filling that gap, to connecting the environment and nature and conservation to local communities and people who don't hear the stories of conservation, and at least they're not hearing it through the lens and with the perspective of people that look like them or share similar experiences to them. And so as I went through my conservation kind of career, it became more and more apparent that the people that were in my classroom, they didn't just adopt that out of nowhere. That was the ethos of people going into conservation overall. and they were setting the stage for what conservation is or is not. And so I remember going through conservation, having a really hard time trying to connect communities and nature together because that really wasn't the foundational principles of conservation. And the other reason I think this is so important to talk about today is that everyone needs to be involved and engaged around important topics around sustainability, conservation, climate change. And we can't get everyone engaged and involved unless we start to break down the science and the data and the knowledge and really treat people like regular people. Yes, we have titles. I might be the CEO of this or the interim director of that. You may be a professor. You may be whatever title that is, but that's not as important. At the end of the day, we're all trying to make our way and find a way to tackle some of the largest conservation issues in the world. And that's going to require us to go past our norms and past our barriers to reach across the aisle and actually engage with people that look, feel, and experience things different than us. If we truly want to tackle something like climate change, it starts with a conversation. And that is what conservation is. It's a conversation with diverse individuals, because we are where we are today, while at the same time, conservation has been right alongside with us. So there's a cap, in my opinion, to what conservation can accomplish. And that cap is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And until we break through that cap, we're never going to really tackle the big issues that are plaguing our planet. And I also want to take a quick second to just really thank DU for doing something special, which is even just bringing me in as the moderator for this panel. What does that mean? What does that look like? So they've paid someone who is a, Black, someone who fits into the Black, Indigenous people of color, or Asian Latinx community. I also identify with the LGBT community. And what that means and what they've done, what they've leveraged is the opportunity for us to widen the lens of who has access and who attends events such as this. So I've leveraged my network globally. There are people and folks from Mexico who are super excited, who are my friends from when I went to graduate school in Mexico, who want to attend this webinar. And there are other communities that probably never would have thought about coming to this webinar if I wasn't leveraging my network and bringing them to this specific webinar. So I'm just really excited to have the opportunity to have this conversation around native plants and sustainability. And with that being said, today we have three amazing panelists that are going to give us a presentation focused on seeing plants and sustaining communities. So up first, we have Professor Jonathan Sharkin, who's going to give us our first presentation, followed by Professor Nicole Herzog, and then followed by Professor Carlos Jimenez. So Professor Jonathan, do you want to come on up?
Sure. Thank you very much, Leander. Yeah, thank you. Just waiting for the PowerPoint presentation to start. Thanks. So my name is Jonathan Sharkin. I'm an associate professor of history and also of Judaic studies. I'm cross-appointed. I'm also the chair of the Department of History. And I want to say, just to begin, that I am the only one on this panel who has never actually published something in this field, although I have really made working with native plants and trying to spread knowledge about native plants. It's been a big part of my life over the last 3+ years. And I think really, especially over the past 2 years, as I have worked to establish a native garden in my own yard. One thing I'll say is I grew up in Rhode Island in a neighborhood that did have sort of the idyllic American lawn. My father is a tremendous gardener, really did a great job in terms of taking care of that lawn. I hated when he would ask me to mow it. It had to be perfect. There was a lot of work that went into it. When I then dumped grass clippings into the backyard, I would get poison ivy all the time. So I'm someone who actually grew up and didn't want a yard. I thought it was too much work. It always had to be perfect. And it was something that I just would not be good at. Would you please advance one slide, please? And then in 2017, right around the time I got tenure at DU, I arrived here in 2010, received tenure in 2017. My wife and I, with our small child, and she was pregnant with our second child at the time, bought a house in the suburbs in Centennial. And all of a sudden, I had a yard. And what was interesting is when we were on in the market for a house, I was actually trying to find the smallest possible lot because I didn't want to do any kind of yard work. And then when we bought the house at first, my wife was 5 months pregnant with our second child. So the first couple of years, I didn't really focus on the yard a lot, except to view it as a burden. I viewed it as something that I was sort of forced to take care of every week or a couple of weeks. And I inherited a yard that was landscaped with an active irrigation system. It had a lot of turf grass. And yet, even with the irrigation system, I noticed that the grass grew poorly or not at all in certain places. I came to realize that the yard had a lot of noxious weeds, including bindweed, which I soon learned about living in Colorado. What I also vividly remember from 2017, 2018, even though I was sort of in a fog of having a young child and being tired all the time, was that, people would give me advice about the yard, and the advice was always something like, oh, your soil's terrible, or, this is Colorado, nothing grows here, or you just have to throw a lot of water at it. And I didn't know very much about yard maintenance, but I knew that we lived in an area with very low rainfall and precipitation relative to where I grew up in Rhode Island. And so that always kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I also just didn't like how it looked aesthetically. No matter what I did, I couldn't make the yard look sort of like it was supposed to. And so I decided by the end of 2018, first of all, I was sick of mowing the lawn. Second of all, I just wanted to find a way that it could actually look maybe more what I perceived to be more natural. And I started doing a lot of research during the fall of 2018 after that growing season, trying to find sort of solutions to my, what I perceived to be my yard problem. I very quickly came across the Plant Select program. The Plant Select program is an excellent program that grows adapted plants that do very well in Colorado, in the Front Range ecosystem. And that's because we live in one of the 4 major steppe ecosystems in the world. They're marked by low rainfall, but not quite sort of being where a desert is. They also tend to have alkaline soils, high winds, lots of hail. And so it can be challenging to grow plants in these areas. So in 2019, I set about sort of transforming the yard. One thing before I move on, I just want everyone to take a look at the left side, right? This area where grass just would not grow, where there was a lot of bindweed. So next slide, please. So in 2019, I radically transformed my yard using a lot of Plant Select plants, step adapted plants. But very quickly while I was doing this and doing more research, and this is where maybe the obsessive humanities researcher in me comes out, I just wasn't satisfied finding Plant Select. I needed to read more and more and more, and found the Colorado Native Plant Society, and also found the Wild Ones organization, found the works of Douglas Tallamy. I read Douglas Tallamy's work. He's an entomologist at the University of Delaware who spends a lot of time talking about the importance of plants to native ecosystems. And so while some of the non-native steppe adapted plants that I bought from the Plant Select program at local nurseries thrived in my yard, I came to the conclusion that native plants are actually the way to go. And the reason I did this is I concluded this is because of their roles in the ecosystem. So if you're just worried about soil conservation and having pretty blooms, non-native steppe adapted plants are very good, and they can also provide important nectar sources for pollinators. So I don't mean to sort of undersell them. On the other hand, native plants are super important, both because they are also adapted to our native soils, but because of the broader role they play in the ecosystem. They not only act as sources of pollen and nectar for native pollinators, but they also act as host plants. And in acting as host plants for caterpillars, they really do a phenomenal job in feeding bird species and ensuring that we have a decently functioning ecosystem. And so for me, the importance of growing native plants very quickly became linked to, interestingly, attracting native insects, attracting butterflies and moths. And this goes against sort of the suburban ideal of, spraying pesticides, ensuring bugs don't get into, or insects don't get into your house. I actually went the other way and tried to attract as many insects as I could with the idea that they would eventually keep the ecosystem in check. And one thing I want to note, both when I started using step-adapted plants and also native plants by 2020, when I switched to using only native plants, it turns out my soil was fine. I was just trying to grow the wrong things there, non-native turfgrass. If you look to the right, that is the area that was on the left before, where nothing grew. And here you see native Rocky Mountain bee plant, the Latin name, I'll always mispronounce these because I only know them from reading, Cleum cerulata, followed by, in the back, a lot of annual sunflower, with this which is Helianthus annuus. There are dozens of more native annuals and perennials mixed in here. And so both the step-adapted non-native plants and also the native plants I then started incorporating really just took off. And it was great. So next slide, please. And then what I want to note is that the promise, when I read Ptolemy, I was thinking, okay, I want to attract all of these insects. Will it actually work? Yeah, it works. There was a huge payoff. All of a sudden, I had dozens of native bee species and butterflies, hummingbirds, goldfinches, other birds coming to my yard all the time. And this is where, I don't know if you want to call it an obsession or an addiction, but this is where I really became an activist. And my goal shifted from merely having a sustainable landscape that looked good, from my perspective, to one that actually helps rebuild the ecosystem. And my new focus was not just growing plants because they look a certain way. It was on trying to create certain conditions for birds, like adding native shrubs that have fruit in the winter, ensuring there was bare soil for ground nesting bees, not cleaning up the yard until May, or preferably never. And then beyond that, I started seeking out online and in-person communities to help add native plants to public and private yards and gardens in the metro area, both to improve the ecosystem, but so others could experience sort of this new joy that I had. And it was pretty cool because I was someone who went from not wanting a yard at all to all of a sudden it became sort of my primary hobby. So can you go forward one more slide as well? And so here we see more pollinators on Gaillardia aristata to the left and Helianthus annuus to the right. So how does this fit into social justice? First, I think it's important to talk about social responsibility for those of us who have the means and good fortune to have land in suburban or urban landscapes. We're responsible for managing the watershed, conserving resources, ensuring that our landscapes contribute to and do not just harm local ecosystems, and all of our modern homes in some way do harm the ecosystem. Yards with non-native grass, invasive plants, or non-natives, or all non-natives, tend to harm the ecosystem, especially when land managers use fertilizers, pesticides, and large-scale supplemental irrigation. Working with native plants allows one to have profuse blooms and rich biodiversity that attract far more insects and birds without additional inputs or harmful chemicals. Second, this kind of landscape ethic has the power to transform suburban and urban locations into urban pollinator and biodiversity hotspots. In doing so, these yards can aid in combating pollinator decline. By ensuring insect and bird health and attracting pollinators to yards, especially near or in lower income suburban and urban locations, we can also make it easier to grow food in community gardens and also in home gardens. I'd also say having robust pollinator and bird populations can also ensure that residents in lower income suburban and urban environments have exposure to nature. And this has significant benefits also to mental health. I can just speak, it's only anecdotally, but about that during the pandemic. Douglas Halamy, who I mentioned before, talks about bringing nature home to gardens. I actually think we can also talk about it in terms of urban areas and food deserts too. It's also worth noting that once gardeners grow these plants, their plants will produce more seeds than necessary, even after animals eat them in the winter. And this means that those of us who do this can share seeds or grow plants that can be given away to others in the community or donated to community gardens. I also want to note that there's a big connection between native plants and other environmental issues. It's linked to water conservation, mitigating climate change with deep-rooted plants that can capture carbon, and also protecting and rejuvenating soil. So this is not just about gardening to garden as a hobby, it's about using it to rebuild our native ecosystems. Final slide, please. And so my final point here, changing yard preferences is difficult. We've been socialized over the past 80 to 90 years, and certainly after World War II, to think that the suburban lawn is the ideal aesthetic with some non-native plants thrown in that maybe come from the Eurasian landmass. And I'm trying to change that, and others I know and work with are trying to change that. What I think is important is for those of us who do this to share our passions without being pushy. Another thing to note is that signage is important. And if you see here, I have a Xerces Society pollinator habitat sign. So I demonstrate to my neighbors who mostly do have traditional turf lawns that I'm doing this for a reason. I would also say that we need to start trying to understand that having a yard should not simply be for show. It has to contribute to the local ecosystem. And if you're looking for inspiration and you're starting out, I would say read works by authors like Douglas Tallamy or Heather Holm. Visit the Xerces Society website, the Denver Audubon website, the Colorado Native Plant Society website, or the website of the Front Range Wild Ones organization chapter. It's pretty easy to get involved, and there is already a strong community that's dedicated to making change in our community. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sharkin. I really appreciate that. And I have a lot of ideas and questions running through my head right now. And I hope those of you that are listening out there as well, please make sure to use the Q&A function to ask any questions of the panelists. And I will be going through a facilitated Q&A towards the end. And then we'll also address any questions that are in the Q&A as well. So with that being said, we have Professor Nicole Herzog up next. If you'd like to come on to view.
Hello. Well, thank you for the introduction, Leander, and I'm really excited to be a part of this panel. I am really inspired by the other work that's being done. And so I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. I'm an archaeologist, and I run the Paleo Diet Lab here on campus. And paleo diet in this sense is probably not what you're thinking. It's not about dieting per se. It's about learning more about past and present diets through archaeobotanical and ethnographic research. And so I was invited to the panel today to talk to you about a project that we are running through the Paleo Diet Lab. So if you want to move to the next slide. Right, so the project is called Plants Bridging People, and it's a project that represents a community-based program, research program in Northeastern California. And the idea for the program is to build a relationship between several different groups of interested parties who all want to preserve and protect native plants. And so the team includes myself and my research colleagues, Jim O'Connell at the University of Utah, and Jen Rovanpera, who's with the BLM, and members of the Pit River, the Paiute, and the Maidu tribes, and also the advocacy group, Resources for Indian Student Education. And so really the primary goal of the project is to build a role for traditional plant use and ethnobotany in land management. So if you could move to the next slide. Right. So I see this project as having three kind of large goals. And the first of those goals is knowledge co-creation. And by that, I mean the co-production of knowledge by assisting, valuing, and incorporating local traditional ecological knowledge in research. And you have probably already heard of the phrase traditional ecological knowledge before. People shorten it up to say tech. And I'm using that term traditional ecological knowledge in two ways. And the first is in reference to ways of knowing about the natural world that are gathered using observational and experimental techniques that are passed down generationally. But a second way to think about the term tech is as a concept, one that invites us to learn from one another about what knowledge actually is in the first place, and how our different approaches to knowledge can actually facilitate these really interesting and meaningful collaborative stewardship opportunities for natural resources. So in order to kind of support this idea of engaging in traditional ecological knowledge, our team has sort of organized these ethnobotanical field trips for K through 12 students that take place on public lands. And each field trip is sort of focused on a different set of resources that are specifically culturally important plants. And what we do is discuss the archaeological research that's related to identifying the use of these plants in the past. And then tribal elders share information about their use of the plants, both past and contemporary. So elders are speaking and interacting with youth and with non-native practitioners also. Participants are also introduced to methods used to document and describe plant ecology and distribution so that they can begin to collect that kind of data themselves independently. And so that's really the most important aspect of the project, is to create opportunities for us to engage with and learn from one another. Next slide, please. Yes, and so then the second big goal is one of informed management. So we take what we learn and we hope that we can build management goals that incorporate that knowledge. So the thing about this is that many tribal members still rely on traditionally gathered plants, but due to a long history of dispossession, most of the places where those plants were traditionally gathered are now private property. And so consequently, the importance of public lands has really increased for folks. And these lands are maybe some of the only places where tribal members can continue traditional practices and have opportunities to pass down their essential ethnobotanical knowledge. And so because these public lands constitute often or almost always unceded territories, and because Native communities continue to use them for traditional hunting and gathering, we want to try to introduce management practices on these public lands that are informed by, or that at least consider and implement some elements of traditional ecological knowledge. And so one branch of our project actually entails engaging in traditional land management practices to document the role of these processes on plant community health and productivity. So for example, you can see in the picture on the top right, there is a woman digging up some roots, and she's a Northern Paiute woman. This picture was taken in the 60s or 70s, but it turns out that root gathering is like just one of the most central aspects of life in this region. It's important socially, it's important economically, and it has been for millennia. And another thing that we know for sure is that people used burning as a way to manage these really important root gathering sites. And so what we've done is to work with the BLM to actually conduct controlled burns on publicly managed lands, to target these root patches, and then to see whether or not burning actually has positive outcomes in terms of these specific foods. And of course, we have collected the data now over several years, and what we can demonstrate is that the traditional ecological knowledge about burning as a tool for improving these plant communities is right on. And so what we want to do is then use this information to help inform future management strategies for these resources, and like just really build a more equitable model of information gathering and sharing that takes into account Indigenous perspectives on plant and land use. So, oh, and I wanted to, dang, I forgot to tell you on the last slide about one of our participants. His name is Paul, and in the last slide, he was actually digging up some tubers with traditional digging sticks that we made as part of the workshop. And that was a really special workshop day because Paul's grandmother was actually a traditional healer, and he was able to share with us a lot of information about traditional medicinal plants, how to identify them, how to use them. And so these have just been really great opportunities for us to work together. So yeah, please go ahead to the next slide. Right. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you a little bit about the archaeology. So the third goal of the project is to identify these culturally important locations on the landscape and to document the kind of activities that people were engaged in at these sites in the past. And my role in this work is to identify which types of plants people used at each site, which tools they used to process them, and then to think about how this reflects broader landscape use and management. And so one of the ways that we do this is by extracting plant residues that have been left behind on these archaeological objects, and then using microscopic techniques to identify which foods are present on each tool. And then we kind of link all of these observations up with modern plant distribution data, with settlement pattern data, and this helps us kind of put together a more holistic picture of what the landscape was like in the past and how people might have engaged with it. And in the photos here, you can see us, we are in the field at an archaeological site, and we are actually collecting samples from archaeological objects on site. And then we'll take those samples to the lab here at DU to do the lab work. And there's a picture of me holding up one of these pestles. This would have been like a grinding implement that would have been used in a big mortar bowl. And then some other objects that we've also tested in the lab to see if we can figure out what kind of plant foods these items were used to process. So I think we can move to the next slide. Yeah, and so here we are, you know, doing all of these different activities to engage in traditional ecological knowledge. And what we found is that we were just amassing all of this data. And it's really useful and really important data. And so we decided that what we would do with the data is make it online, publicly available to anybody that wants to see it. And so we created this digital database that's hosted on the Natural History Museum of Utah's website, and you can see the web address there. And the database includes detailed plant descriptions. It includes tips for identifying these plants in the wild. It includes locational data, photographs of the botanical and microbotanical elements of the plants. And most importantly, it includes excerpts regarding the traditional and contemporary uses of each plant. And so our idea, or our big hope and dream here, is that the outcomes of this work provide several sets of knowledge for us to engage with, for the public to engage with, and hopefully create a space for sort of collaborative engagement in learning about these plants and learning how to value native plants. And our hope is that the more engaged we are as a public in learning about the history and heritage of these native species, the more likely we are to work toward collective solutions for protecting them. And so I think I will end there. That's my spiel.
That was a really great spiel. Appreciate that, Professor Herzog, and so many great points, beautiful story, great connections to land, history, indigenous values. I really appreciate what you bring to the table. So next up, we have Professor Jimenez. If you'd like to come off of camera and mute. Perfect.
Thank you, Leander. Good evening, everybody. My name is Carlos Jimenez, and I'm an assistant professor in the Media, Film, and Journalism Studies Department. And my interests broadly are in media, technology, and labor. And so I've done work on farm workers in California. Here in Colorado, I've done work with day laborers, all looking at the way they use technology. The work that you'll hear today is focused on farm workers in California. It's a little bit more macro than some of the work that we've been hearing. One pitch I want to make is that some of the new work that I've been doing is on oral histories. I have a project with a few colleagues called Documenting Colorado's Hidden Voices. This is an oral history project, and really we are trying to capture voices from across the state that we don't often hear from. And so if you know anybody that has lived an interesting life and has a story that hasn't been told and is not being heard, we would really love if you could connect us. So that's my pitch. But again, the work that I'm going to talk to you about today, it's called The Digitization of Strawberries and Farm Workers. And slide. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the automation of strawberry harvesters. Let's try to advance that slide. Let's see if it'll work. Yeah, there it goes. All right, look at that machine. That's really why I wanted you to see it. This is an automated strawberry harvester coming to a field near you. Well, not so much, but you'll see. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the origins of these machines, why they've become more prominent in the last decade, and then we're going to jump inside the mind of the robot, really to understand how is it that these machines see. How is it that they see strawberries, and what does that mean for human sight, human touch, and agriculture more broadly? Let's do a slide. Strawberries are incredibly labor intensive. 1 acre is over 1,000 hours of manpower compared to most other fruits and vegetables. They're under 100 hours. So it's no surprise that in the 1960s, folks tried to mechanize the operation. You see a machine here. And they were largely failures. Strawberries, as they quickly learned, are incredibly delicate to the touch. And so these machines were mass harvesting. They were also picking up everything, including the bad strawberries. So it was not a very profitable endeavor. But things, of course, have changed. Slide. We now have automated robots, and this is where the digitization of strawberries comes in. And these new machines are now outfitted. Let's do slide. Are now outfitted with cameras, algorithms, and robotic arms, and they are extraordinarily precise. They can do their work without damaging the strawberry. One thing that I want to make sure I riff on a couple times here is that, to my surprise at least, these robots don't actually see more. In fact, they see less as they go on through their visual process. So this is something I'll keep touching on. But why are we seeing more of these robots? Let's do a slide. Strawberries are high value specialty crops. They are very, very profitable. It's $2.2 billion in profits in 2020. Slide. There we go. And there, a large part of this profit gets eaten away by workers. Workers make up over 50% of the production cost. And so if there's a way in which to reduce this or to replace it, growers and farmers are going to be very interested. Another factor at play here is that farmers, growers in the United States have been experiencing a labor shortage for over a decade. And this is not just in the United States. Most other developed nations around the globe are experiencing labor shortage because young people simply do not want to work in this sector. And so technology like automation has gotten a lot more look, a lot more attention because of these factors. Slide. One thing to know is that this AgBot is actually not coming to a field near you anytime soon. They're not widespread. They're not widely commercially available. In fact, there's a couple of experiments in California and in Florida, but that's mostly it at this point. Really, what I want to get across here is that there's this idea, there's this boosterism around automation within agriculture that really is distracting us from actually talking about the technology, understanding what is it capable of and what is it not capable of. And this is sort of where we're going to go to in the next little bit. But to start, we'll start to jump inside the mind of the robot. So let's hit slide. Machine vision, how these machines ultimately see, really tries to mimic the human perceptual process. And of course, our visual process is extremely complicated. And for machines, I'm going to simplify it for us. Really, they start off through a sensing operation, and they use that through sensors that you might find in Nikon cameras, Canon cameras, your video recorder. Of course, they might have some more that are a little bit more advanced, like thermal and infrared. But this ultimately allows the machine to capture light, color, visual information, and now it's sensed. Great. The next step in this is to interpret this information. To do this, algorithms are key. These are codes, algorithms are created by humans, and it basically tells the machine what to search for. Slide. And this could be a variety of factors that include, for strawberries, for example, could include the color red, a cone-like shape, particular size and or texture. And it uses this ultimately to find exactly what it's been told to look for and then remove the rest. So at the end here in this image, you see a berry that is just floating there, looking very, very delicious in its digital self. Let's do a slide. There's a couple more images here that I have for you from other fruits and vegetables that have been attempted to be automated. And what I want you to see is that it's not actually the fruit that the machine at the end of the day sees. It gets this abstracted view of a lemon and orange, and it's removing as much detail as possible to simplify its identification process. Slide. So these machines are not actually seeing oranges, limes, strawberries. In fact, for them, they see this white cone-shaped thing that's floating in a black abyss. It's not really a strawberry. Slide. So if it's not a strawberry, what is it? Well, for the machine, it's an abstract visual product. At this point, this is the digitization. But it gets really interesting because the machine digitizes the strawberry, this thing that we know is super delicious and sweet, and it's transformed by the machine into a commodity because now that it can see it, it can harvest it and produce a profit. But to remain profitable, it has to be efficient. And this is where it has to reduce the information that it's taking in as much as possible. And this is where I call this limited way of sensing within agriculture, fragmented sensing. And I argue that within agriculture, it's at the crux of digitizing strawberries, automating strawberries. And really one key thing here is that it's at the heart of removing human touch within agriculture so that one day these fruits and vegetables will make it to your marketplace without ever having been touched by a human hand. But these machines are imperfect. Slide. They really can't deal with nature. Nature, they hate it. The sun, they hate the sun because the sun moves and it casts shadows and it makes machine vision's life, automated harvesters, their life, very, very difficult. So when this has been the case historically, we often ask nature to bend a little bit. I'm going to explain this through this slide that you have here. There was a study that found these machines really liked one strawberry over another. And it's not because they could taste them, because of course they can taste, but it's because they could see them better and determine with a higher proficiency whether this strawberry was mature. And of course, then it meant the harvest was more and more successful. So what you have on the right, slide B, is a variety that turned or matured with splotchy redness here and there. But then on the left, the Amatoni variety turned red from the bottom up as if it was being filled up. This created a high contrast edge that was ideal for machine vision and quantification. It could say, oh, here's my berry. Oh, this much is red. I have to wait a little bit more before it hits that 90 and I know it's going to be mature. But this is going to have significant implications beyond agriculture. Basically, to help automation succeed, we're going to implicitly favor a visual world and a natural world that expresses itself with a high contrast color border, kind of like we're seeing here with these strawberries. Things that are too fuzzy with colors or objects are not going to be seen by these machines. Slide. The history of technology and agriculture has taught us a couple of things. When tomatoes, for example, were mechanized, they weren't smart enough to do everything in the harvest, which meant and ultimately led to workforce fragmentation. So once on the tomato harvest, there was, year-round work. Now this work becomes fragmented. It becomes seasonal. There's an increase in post-harvest jobs to help clean up the harvest ultimately. And of course, these jobs are paid much, much less. Automation is going to do something very similar. Slide. There is now increasing evidence showing that automation and data-driven technology are not a revolution at all, but instead they're going to intensify conventional agriculture with more of the same inequality, more of the same attempts at labor control that we have seen historically. There are a couple of trends in the research that I'm going to point out here, 3 in particular. The first research is showing that within automation, there's going to be a bifurcated labor force where we have high-tech skilled workers on one end and low-skilled workers on the other who are going to experience stagnant wages, increased employer scrutiny and surveillance, and again, more worker fragmentation, what we've already been seeing with every other innovation within agriculture. Number 2, farmers are unfortunately not going to come out ahead in this situation. The implementation of this technology requires an immense amount of capital, and this is going to put farmers into debt. Worse, agricultural companies like John Deere, Cargill, they are the ones who collect and own the data from the farms that use their technology. So they are the ones that are going to see the greatest economic benefit. Lastly, number 3 here, there is a privileging of data over embodied experience. research, for example, on truck drivers, they sort of studied them, found patterns for best practices, and they created an aggregation of data. And then they applied an algorithm to that to help determine and make decisions. What's happening with truck drivers now is that they're relying on a central dispatch to tell them what to do, and it's overriding what they used to call road knowledge, that experience that they got on the road firsthand. Police officers are experiencing the same thing. Their experience and work is being digitized, and there's an algorithm now telling them what to do. For them, they used to call their embodied knowledge Midas, which is, again, this on the ground, firsthand experience. Farm workers are going to experience something very, very similar. So in closing here, let's do slide. As humans increasingly delegate everyday visual tasks to automation, cars are probably one of the bigger things you know about, it becomes really important for us to understand how these machines see and how they interact with our environment. And from this presentation, I hope to give you a few takeaways here. One, we really need to be paying attention to the inefficiencies and the shortcomings of these technologies. This is where the greatest ripple effects are going to be located. And oftentimes we're going to be a little bit distracted by the awe of this workerless farm. So that's one thing to be aware of. Number two, the digitization process is ultimately going to restructure our sensorial experience. We are just going to, in order to make automation work, we're going to have to make some sacrifices. We're going to be privileging high contrast borders. Touch, for example, is going to be offloaded onto automation, and it's going to mess with, our sensorial experience as we know it. Maybe not today, but, and lastly, the successful automation of strawberry harvesting is going to be, once that's done perfectly, that is going to be a watershed moment, and there will be a couple. But once this happens, we are going to see automation well outside of the industrial and the agricultural sectors. Slide, and this is why I just say thank you so much for listening.
Wow, very powerful. I would love to invite all the panelists to come off of mute and off of camera to come back up. That was such an amazing discussion. I really appreciate all three of you engaging around this topic. And I didn't tell this to you all as we were talking, prepping for this, but I remember it being in conservation courses, and whenever we had to get to plants, I was like, nope, not me. I don't want to deal with it. This is boring. I don't care about photosynthesis. I get it. Let's move on. But if I had the three of you as my professor, oh my goodness, I would be really into plants a lot more than I am right now. So I really appreciate the three of you having such a robust discussion about plants and communities. That really would have touched my heart and made me more engaged in this work altogether. So I'm going to ask each of you some targeted questions, and then we're going to take a look at the Q&A and see what's going on there. So, and I'm just going to use your first name. We've already talked ahead of time. We all know each other. So not being disrespectful, I know them well enough that I can call them by their first name. So Carlos, we'll start with you. So how do you see the digitization of strawberries? And I really appreciate what you did to help us really understand sensing and perception. What impact is that going to have on farm workers, and how does that fit into the national discourse we're having right now around farm workers, and especially immigrant farm workers or migrant workers, about their conditions, their pay, but yet the overwhelming need for them, as well as making sure that we acknowledge their historical contributions before this machine comes to a land near you? How do we make sure that we don't lose the fact that these people really paid through blood and sweat to make sure we get where we are today?
It's a great question, Leander, and thank you for that. Honestly, I think the problem is that they are already largely invisible within the discourse. We often only hear them when there's emergencies or real urgencies around them, and even then, it's typically not even about them. And so I think what automation is adding is another layer of invisibility, unfortunately. I think, to your point, agricultural workers within the United States and globally have subsidized the production and the costs for lots of consumers, including us. And I think what we're going to increasingly see is the portrayal of not only agricultural workers, but workers more generally that are costly and too unruly and too activist, and machines, of course, can't complain. And so that's sort of the discourse, the shift that you might see going forward.
I love that. I appreciate that. And so then for Nicole, one of the things that struck me as you were talking about your discussion, it was that how does like the global reckoning that we're seeing right now about how we've co-opted indigenous practices such as regenerative agriculture, which is really just, another form of indigenous practices, and yet we are benefiting from them, and we are kind of calling it like a new term now, right? Like, oh, this is regenerative agriculture, and this is how you should do it. And yet there were all these traditional practices. And I think back to even, again, getting my education, we understood that fire was an important aspect of the landscape, but it wasn't taught to me as if anyone else knew about this until that day. Like, this is a brand new thing. Fire is something that we discovered, and we know how to take care of the land because of it. But instead, actually, practice has been going on for a very long time. Like, that was never touched on in my education. So yeah, just any thoughts you have about the discourse about kind of taking indigenous knowledge and co-opting it and making sure that we acknowledge the past and what they've contributed to this?
That's a really, really good question. And I think it's just super important, right, that we make sure that Indigenous voices are at the forefront of our engagement with this, with traditional ecological knowledge, and that, right, we make sure that we acknowledge that this is knowledge and data and information that have been collected over millennia. These are not just like incidental things that people learned. It's committed time and energy to learning about how our ecosystems work and what sorts of management practices impact what sorts of plants and animals. And that kind of knowledge is not easy to come by. And so, yeah, I think you're right that we really have to emphasize that this knowledge has really deep roots, that this is a scientific pursuit, right? To make observations about how the things you do impact the environment around you, and to store that data over long periods of time, and to look at those interactions. I mean, this is more data than any modern scientist could ever hope to collect in their lifetime, right? And so, yes, it's so important to acknowledge that. And I think we need to do a better job of listening. We need to hear what Indigenous communities want to see happen, how they want to see this engagement with forms of traditional ecological knowledge. And so, yeah, I think that is a main goal for all of us, is to stop talking and to start listening. And so hopefully we can do more of that in the future.
I love that. Thank you. And listening is definitely a core piece of this entire process, probably for everyone. So another question I have is for Jonathan. So you kind of started to touch on this concept. So we're ingrained from day one about the perfect American life, right? The perfect family with the perfect dog, with the perfect lawn. And you're kind of disrupting that with the idea of like, oh, a lawn could look different. Just as we've disrupted a lot of things, like actually you could have other kind of pets besides dogs, and the family doesn't look like what you see on TV. It could be many types of different ways of having a family. When you think about individuals who are just kind of worried about transitioning to native, because one of the things that it does potentially is attract insects, right? You talked about that. And yet the narrative has been kill all insects, right? Or they're gonna like take over your house. So A, have insects taken over your house, and then B, what are the initial steps for people who are out there trying to change their community's minds about what it means to have native species on your land, and how that looks and how that is perceived? I could see a lot of people having negative perceptions, saying, "Oh, why is that crazy neighbor over there having those, letting the weeds grow up like that? It doesn't even look, their perception of it is so different." So I would love to just hear from you. What are some tips that you would give to individuals who are trying to convince or talk to their neighbors about switching over to native?
Sure. Thank you so much for this question. There's a lot there, so if I miss something, please come back and remind me. My house is not overrun with insects, though. I'm always afraid of termites because you can't always see them, but I don't think that I have that. So yeah, it's really, part of the process for me has been learning to love insects and learning to accept them. I was, always afraid of bees. I was afraid of wasps. And now, my wife commented at one point that, my pictures have gotten much better in the yard, and it's solely a function of me not being afraid of insects anymore. That I get closer. I'm around wasps all the time, and I actually have come to love them in the sense that they come and they keep other insects in check. I have assassin bugs in the yard that do the same. I have aphids on my milkweed, and ladybugs come and kill them. So I do think that one thing to note, and people have to know this. First of all, it's a process. Second of all, pesticides, if applied, can harm more than the insects you're trying to target, unfortunately. And so I am really focused on sort of this integrated idea of integrated pest management. And I have to say, it's a very small sample size, but I stopped the pesticide service 3 years ago and have not had an infestation yet. So we will see. And I used to find dead insects on my patio all the time when we did use pesticides. Second, in terms of trying to sort of maybe convince neighbors, yeah, I do think signage, I can't overemphasize that enough. Signage is important. I think another thing that really helps, there are some things that people like, right? People like to see butterflies. People like to see hummingbirds. People like to see birds. And when they show up, I think people start to see what you're trying to do. So sure, people don't want to see wasps, right? But people seem to have less problem with bumblebees or honeybees or different kinds of insects. And so I'm not going to pretend that it's like this perfect solution where it's easy and yeah, I've got a hummingbird that visits every day. People see that and now they're going to want to do what I'm doing. I think it's going to be a slow change. I also just want to note, I don't believe in trying to mandate changes. I do think water should be priced properly, but I don't think we should be trying to mandate change or even out there trying to knock on doors and convincing people to do things. I think we have to take a measured response. And one final point I want to note, I'm fortunate enough. I live a few houses away from an elementary school. My kids can go play on the grass there. Not everyone's in the same position. Some people live away from don't have access to that, and so they actually do need lawns in a sense to for their kids or for others to move around. I don't feel that I have to do that, and so I don't do that. So the way I view it is, every piece of my property, because I'm not using it most of the time, I want to dedicate to helping insects, improving the ecosystem. But again, that's also from a position of privilege. And so we have to remember that it has to be, different scenarios for different people depending on the positions they're in.
I love that. Thank you so much for that. And actually, what we'll do is let's go ahead and get into some of the Q&A that we see here in the chat. A lot of people are asking some great questions, and I want to kind of get to as many as possible before our time is up. So first up actually is back to you, Jonathan. So I'm glad you took that swig of water to refresh yourself. And which gets to the question, which is around the idea of maintaining your yard without supplemental watering and only using rainfall. And, tying it into just the second comment here, how does the water issue connect to the bigger picture of social justice and land stewardship?
Yeah, I think that water is improperly priced. I think that we use a ton of it. I know I use a ton of it indoors. I'm a Northeasterner. My wife's from California. She hates the way I brush my teeth with leaving the faucet running. So I do, and I know I'm wrong. I'm trying to break that habit. When it comes to, so I'll say when it comes to rainfall, I shut off my irrigation system in 2018 and never turned it back on. I'm roughly 80% below Denver Water's efficiency targets every summer. And so I don't think I've had a water bill above $40 since this started. That said, I don't actually rely solely on rainfall. I do hand water a little, especially in the spring, to get plants established. I did create some ditches near my downspouts to create the equivalent of riparian areas so I could grow certain kinds of plants. I think I personally morally can sort of make peace with that because some of the plants that grow in riparian areas are actually really tremendous host plants that in upland, dry sort of sites we would not necessarily have to grow. And since some of the riparian areas have been taken over by invasives. I do think that it's for those of us who maybe can add a few of those to our yard to sort of help the broader ecosystem, that's a good use of water. Like, so for me, I'm trying to not just not use water, I'm trying to use it in a way that will have the biggest possible impact, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that. So next question is for Nicole. So what kinds of generational differences have you come across in knowledge and attitudes towards native plants and their uses?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I do think maybe there is a gap in interest. It seems like a lot of older folks in the communities are interested in plants. They have a lot of knowledge about plants, and then there's sort of a gap where I don't know why that gap exists, but where people were taken away from their interest in plants and nature, or maybe I don't know what they did. They went somewhere else or did something else, and so there's a little bit of a gap there. And then younger people are also really excited and really interested in learning about the plants. And so, yeah, there is something interesting going on there. But it seems like we've had really, really good engagement with young folks. And so I find that really encouraging.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's good to hear as well. Very encouraging. So a question for Carlos. You've already answered this, but I would love to hear you talk about it out loud. So one of the audience members said that they were wondering about, they were struck by what you were saying about pay attention to imperfection and what that looks like in terms of sustainability. That's a very interesting question. And I would love to hear how you respond to that. And even Jonathan, Nicole, if you have any thoughts about this idea of kind of imperfection and sustainability and what that looks like.
I can start us off, but I'm going to hand it off to my colleagues very quickly, only because I think they're going to be better suited for this question. And in my personal life, I'm all about the mess. I'm all about the imperfection. And I think within the specific research that I'm talking about, I think the imperfection is ignored. And I think that's the fundamental problem with automation is we get distracted by the boosterism and the speculative future that seems so wonderful. And so for me, bringing one thing to be able to undo that is to look at the imperfections. But I'm really curious to hear from my fellow panelists what they think.
Jonathan, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm happy to go first. This is actually a really important issue for those of us in sort of like local, I mean, I think national, but local native plant advocacy as well. I think that it's going to be, there's no perfection, right? We're never going to get rid of invasive plants. We've created artificial environments, like on the Front Range, for example. We have so many non-native trees that are planted, especially from the East Coast, that really shouldn't be here, but are now here, and we have to make do with them. And if we remove them, that would actually hurt some of our attempts to mitigate climate change. And so for me, I guess the way I look at it is we have to sort of maybe, and I hope this is answering the question and sort of the way it's asked, we have to take small steps, and anything we do is better than nothing. And so just taking small steps and doing what you can is going to make small improvements. Hopefully it will lead to larger improvements. But I struggle with this because I'm someone who always like wants to, talk about like let me give 100% effort. Like that's never possible.
Great. Nicole, any thoughts on imperfection and sustainability in terms of what you're doing as well?
I think so. I think people often have an idea about what a pristine landscape might look like. And they often ignore the fact, or maybe are unaware of the fact that almost all of the landscapes around us are human modified landscapes in some way or another, right? And so when we think about conservation, I think people get left out of the equation a lot. And we're a part of the natural system, just like anything else. We maybe are more destructive or maybe do things differently than other animals and plants. But I mean, humans are a part of the system too. And so the ways that humans manipulate and change our ecosystems are important for us to think about, because they're value added sometimes. I think we often think that all humans do are destroy things, but in fact, we can add value to ecosystems too. And so we should think about about the ways that we can contribute to and you know, that we operate within these systems instead of always seeing ourselves as inside or out. And so, yeah, I think that that would be my idea about that imperfect systems.
No, I really appreciate that. And that idea of imperfection is really just good to talk about, because I think, you know, growing up, again, this idea of perfection is kind of slammed into us on a daily basis of what is perfection, right? And who tells the story of what is perfection, right? What does perfect look like? So if we start to tell the story that imperfection is perfection, that could change the game for people growing up and trying to understand this process. So another question that came through that I would love to hear from folks as well is, you know, who are the other organizations, partners, and, you know, students that are involved in the work that you all are doing? Just kind of expanding beyond just the work that, you know, just seeing your face in your work. What are some other kind of organizations that are working to collaborate with you or trying to carry this work moving forward? And what are their interests and impact in this work?
Got it. No, I'm just kidding. At least for the research, a lot of the impetus for the research for me comes from a very key organization in Oxnard, California. It's called the Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project, and they advocate on the behalf of indigenous farm workers, indigenous Mexican farm workers, which many people may not know. It's not just any typical Mexican immigrant that's harvesting in California. By and large, it's indigenous Mexicans who don't speak Spanish as their first language. They speak indigenous languages. But you know, the chain of foreign workers, and it's a great advocacy organization. So they're one of my key partners that I've been working with for a long, long time.
Yeah, I'm just going to note, I mean, there are a lot of people in the metro area who know more than I do about this, many of whom I think are listening in right now. And so one group that I'm pretty active in on the local level is Wild Ones, the Front Range chapter. It's an organization dedicated to rewilding landscapes, especially in the suburbs. The organization on the national level also has grants for youth who are trying to make differences in their communities and also in schools. The Front Range chapter tries to build gardens in Denver, elsewhere, trying to, I think, restore local ecosystems. Colorado Native Plant Society does phenomenal work. I've done some writing for their website. They have tremendous resources online. The Denver Audubon Center has a great list of plants that are important for native bird populations that I believe Kate Hogan created. There's also the High Plains Environmental Center in Loveland. There's the Xerces Society nationally. University of Texas at Austin with wildflower.org has some really great resources. And this is just what I'm sort of relying on. There are, and I want to note that's a limited set, but these are organizations that I would say on a daily basis, like I visit their websites, I try to learn more, or in some cases like Front Range Wild Ones and Colorado Native Plant Society, I try to contribute myself in some way.
Yeah, and I'll say for our project, I would really have to hand it to the group Resources for Indian Student Education, because they have really reached out to us and engaged with us and gotten tribal youth interested in this project and gotten them out on public lands, looking at plants. They've really facilitated these field trips that we've done. And so we have both Native and non-Native students join the field trips. And it's been really, really incredible to work with these folks and the elders in these communities who are willing to share their knowledge with all of us. So, and this is not the only kind of project like this that's happening out there. The Herrick and Yurok tribes in California are right now working on agreements with major federal agencies to institute traditional burning regimes public lands. And so lots of projects like this are popping up all over, trying to, give some power back to folks to implement these kind of technologies on their unceded lands.
I really love that. Thank you. I appreciate that. Another question that came through, and audience, y'all are killing it, so I appreciate it. So the question of someone who's brand new into sustainability, who is kind of looking around, and what they're seeing is kind of like this, it's this way versus this way, right? It has to be done this way. This is the right way. That way, not as good anymore. That way is not as good as this way. And so they're confused. They're trying to navigate through that process, seeing a field that seems to be, in a sense, polarized, that one way is better than the other way. Is there another way of kind of thinking about sustainability for new people entering into it, or a new way for those of us who are in sustainability to not be so polarized? And what does that look like to not polarize your opinion about it has to be this way or it has to be that way?
Yeah, I'd like to start on this one. And I know, I noted that I try to go 100% native, and in terms of the plants I grow, and that's because, I think, again, I have the space to do it. I have a quarter of an acre, and I can send my kids to play elsewhere. But I don't think that what I do is necessarily the right way, right? Like, I think there are multiple ways to approach this, and we can have individuals sort of tailor their conservation efforts in terms of the kinds of stuff I'm talking about to their own needs. And there are debates, like when I I moderate some Facebook groups, right? And there are big debates about, should you ever use herbicides? Should you ever have any type of lawn? Should you even be growing non-native plants? I don't think it has to be all or nothing. I think that there's also issues related to, again, accessibility. Are people, if they're maintaining a yard and they want to have it all native, for me, like, if they're using herbicides, especially if maybe they have physical limitations, that makes a lot of sense. So what one point I want to make, and maybe this isn't perfectly answering the question, I don't want people to feel guilty because they believe they're not living up to some sort of artificial ethic. These are all social constructions in a way. I'm a person. I'm thinking about this as a person. As Nicole pointed out, we're dealing with all sort of human impacted landscapes. So for me, making any kind of positive change is good, and people can decide what's good for them and what sort of the limit is, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So one of the last questions I have on here is a big question about, there's a lot of programs out there. For instance, Colorado State University and the National Western Center have been advocating or advancing a vision of regenerative agriculture called How the West Was Won, ONE, like one. But that vision doesn't include the real discussion of how the West was won, WON, in terms of ecocidal and genocidal acts that destroy the regenerative agriculture economy in the Great Plains. So the big question here is, what role should DU and CSU and other universities play in ensuring that there is truth, conciliation, acknowledgement, conciliation, and discovery that helps heal and reimagine our relationships with plants and agriculture? So what role do universities play in really elevating those truths and acknowledging the past?
Yeah, I'll go ahead with that. I think it goes back to that idea of thinking about the world around us as if nothing has happened there before, right? And sort of erasing that difficult history. Like I mentioned, folks are sort of forced to do traditional gathering things on public lands because that's all that's available right now to do. And so I think that we do have to pay attention to the fact that people have had to restructure their knowledge about the world in response to the ways that things have been taken away from them. And fire is another really good example. We've had a fire repression policy in the United States, since Smokey the Bear, and that's actually really harmful and really damaging. And so we need to think about ways in which we have taken away those forms of traditional knowledge that are useful and helpful and that we can all engage in for the betterment of everyone, and think about how we can sort of re-implement those things, and knowing that, that we have this difficult history to reckon with in terms of not allowing people to engage in the kinds of practices that they would have traditionally done.
Yes, very powerful. Carlos, Jonathan, anything to add to that? Nicole, you did such a great job. They were speechless. They have nothing else to add to that, which is fantastic. So with that being said, I do want to go ahead and get us wrapped up here. So I would like to invite to the stage Dean Rhonda Gonzalez to give closing remarks.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to just send us off here. And I want to start by thanking you so much, Leander, for moderating our panel, and also to our distinguished panel of DU faculty members, Dr. Sharkin, Herzog, and Jimenez, and to our silent and maybe invisible supporters behind the scenes who made this possible, Dr. Andrea Stanton, Laura Mack, and Jennifer Gardner. And then finally, to all of our community members in attendance tonight. We're just so thrilled that you could join us. I have to say, it was a truly insightful panel of research, messages, stirring challenges, and especially inviting each of us to consider how we might contribute to work on environmental justice and sustainability. And we're all going to hope that Jonathan learns to brush his teeth like a Californian. The College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences is indeed delighted to have such a dynamic and diverse community of professionals and students committed to promoting learning that will transform the world. That's why we show up every day, and we take great pride in assuring that our students develop the skills and perspectives necessary to think critically, question assumptions, and find new angles from which to approach our society's most pressing challenges. We look forward to having you join us for future events, and I'm sure that you will hear from us. We're always excited to see that you've joined up or RSVP to join our panels, and look forward to inviting you to a March panel that will feature some of the innovative work going on in our Center for Innovation and Creative Arts, the Silka Center here at DU. So I wish everybody a good night, a safe night out there if you're in Colorado, where it's particularly cold tonight. And with that, Leander, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if you have anything to tell us.
That is it. Thank you all so very much. I know that this is being recorded, so my assumption is that this will get sent out to those who weren't able to make it tonight. And we're really looking forward to seeing more of your faces in our next meeting and next chat.